Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for another webinar in the Food Industry Executive webinar series. Really excited to have you all here today. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, just drop those questions into the questions panel, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. We will also send out the recording following the broadcast. Welcome to the Aptean and IDC webcast on digital transformation in the food and beverage industry. This webinar will highlight the results and insights derived from a collaborative effort by IDC and Aptean to survey the global food and beverage industry. Our speakers today are Kevin Prouty, Group Vice President for IDC's Manufacturing Insights, and Jack Payne, Vice President of Product Management at Aptean. Both Kevin and Jack bring decades of experience in their industries that give them unique perspectives and insights. Kevin and Jack, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Hillary. I appreciate the time everyone has taken to be in the audience and listen to what we have to say. I think this is going to be a very dynamic approach to how we're going to look at this data. We're going to just take a general look at the data, but I think some of the more valuable information you're going to pull out of this is the conversation Jack and I have about some of the data. It's going to be pretty interactive. This is where I'm hoping this ends up being more of a conversation between Jack and I, where you can listen like you're sitting in a restaurant or a bar, just listening to two people who are working on a project and talking about the results of that project. So as you probably know, this is really to look at the digital state of in the food and beverage industry. There's a bunch of things going on generally in global economic issues around pandemic, in some areas post-pandemic. But also, even before the pandemic, there were a lot of trends happening around food safety, digitization, managing data, consumer demands, and we're going to look at all that stuff, both through the lens of the pandemic and also, separate from the pandemic. So what we're going to look at, what is the importance of digital in food and beverage. There's many different definitions for digital, and we're going to talk about what it means in the food and beverage industry. We're going to look at the challenges both around COVID and post-COVID, the impact of traceability, safety, and sustainability, which are all somewhat linked. And then we're going to take some specific looks at the impact of ERP and cloud on the food and beverage industry, and also some of the stuff that's going around that's impacting ERP and cloud. And then we'll talk about some of our recommendations, things we think are really important for food and beverage executives to prioritize. So I always like to start out by showing you the key takeaways and conclusions, and so you can see kind of how we get there. The 5-year focus for a lot of companies, the big one really is the changing consumer demands, the variability, the dynamicism of the consumer, and then also being prepared and resilient towards future disruptions. Resilience is a word we hear a lot of now. No one can ever predict that something like a global pandemic is going to happen, but you can do a better job of preparing your company for any of those things that happen. That ties into next year's priorities around food safety and traceability. And I think one of the interesting things we're going to talk about is the differing perceptions by different groups of leaders within companies and the maturity of those companies. We're going to look at some of the big technology investments, especially around enterprise software, and how that ties into digital transformation, or as we abbreviate it here at IDC, DX, and how that all that ties into DX efforts and driving changes and improvements in your the metrics you use to measure yourself. And then we're going to take a quick look at cloud ERP and where we see it in the market, the maturity of companies and the benefits they're getting from cloud ERP. So I think one of the first questions is, why are we even talking about digital? What is digital? Digital to us at IDC, and I think Jack at Aptean would agree with this, digital is really being able to apply those digital technologies around data, analytics, we call it big data, whatever you want to call it, cloud, edge computing, all these newer transformational technologies, and how they apply to the business, or how the business applies to them. So one of the things we looked at was the digital maturity of many of the people who took the survey. And I think what you're going to see here is you're going to see a significant change in the maturity level based on companies and how their revenues have increased. So we looked at Industry 4.0, we looked at supply chain management, and we looked at food safety and traceability. And what we found was that companies that had significantly increased their revenues and their profits were significantly more mature in those three categories. It was pretty much straight across the board. So I think that's something you really need to look at and say, how are we using the technologies we have and the business processes we have to apply to smart manufacturing, supply chain management, and food traceability and safety, because those are three really, really big, highly prioritized categories for kind of best-in-class food and beverage companies. And this, just to clarify this, all this data comes from the collaboration that IDC and Aptean did around a food and beverage survey. The N was around 700, just over 700 food and beverage companies that we did just a few months ago. So this is less about the data and more about what IDC sees in the market and the priorities and the trends around what we call digital operations. What are people doing? How are they applying technologies? What use cases are they applying it to, and where are they seeing benefits? We look at 10 big opportunities in food and beverage, and one of them being collaboration platform. You see a lot of AI in here, connected assets, product traceability. Really what this comes down to is being able to use the data you're collecting, use the analytics to draw insights from that data, use your collaboration platforms to develop ecosystems beyond just a standard supply chain, but actually being able to build a backbone that your suppliers and your customers and distributors can use to communicate with you, to share information, to share best practices. That's really, that collaboration platform ties heavily into building your ecosystems and networks. We talk about connected assets, and that is being able to connect your operating assets to an operational data stream so your engineers and subject matter experts can optimize your processes. But we also talk about connecting your products or the packaging for your products so you can do more food traceability and start to really understand food safety from farm to table, because that's in the end what everyone talks about, is going farm to table, being able to trace where the food starts, and the ingredients start, and the feedstock starts, all the way through to where it's consumed, even through multiple processes and multiple companies in your ecosystem. And then there's some basic automation around manual processes and warehouse robotics, but these are the opportunities we see. They were there pre-pandemic, but post-pandemic, most of these are really accelerating in their application. So I think at this point, what we'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the where the food and beverage industry is in relation to the pandemic and what we've seen as a lasting impact. So I'm going to turn to Jack, and I'm going to ask Jack, from a food and beverage perspective, from Aptean's perspective on that, what have you seen being the lasting impact, and how has it impacted companies not only in their business but how they're looking at digitization and technology?
Okay, thanks, Kevin, and first of all, thanks for inviting me in today to share our thoughts, and also looking forward to your very insightful information. But in terms of where we think in terms of digital transformation, and you were talking about the companies that have been resilient with this. I think it was companies that were forward enough thinking pre-pandemic to invest in digital transformation and technology, so they were able to survive, but not only survive, but also many of them are prospering and being very resilient, during the pandemic and now in the stage that we're in. But in terms of, what are the opportunities for those, I think a lot of it depends upon where those companies are today in their digital transformation efforts. And I think the first part is really as you kind of pointed out, was the ecosystems, it's the networks. Do they have the ability not only to communicate internally and share information within the organization, but also with their suppliers and with their customers to be able to see across their supply chain, and also to prepare themselves for what we do talk about from farm to fork, that full extended supply chain. So you have to have that foundation to begin with. And always a clear topic or a key topic is always the food safety traceability. Continues to be top of mind of everyone It's always typically one of the key requirements in most people looking at investing in new technology. But I think the end goal is kind of what you talked about, is really having actionable information. How do we collect this information? And collecting it is not really what you're trying to do. What you're trying to do is to say, how can we make business decisions, the best business decisions, based upon the information that we're gathering? How can we do that very quickly and very agile to be able to position ourselves for success?
I think that's, the ecosystem comment I think is very pertinent, but I think, what we're showing here on the screen right now is the difference between regions. Not massive differences, but you can see staffing and transportation delays are primary worries. And I think, it's been all over the news around the world about supply chain issues. There are also variable demand issues. It tends to be bigger in North America, is what the survey data said. And in APAC especially, lost capacity issues. Factories that have shut down, that have not restarted, or have not restarted at full capacity. So I think what you're talking about is pretty important. I think the ecosystem piece especially hits on kind of the rip from the headline supply chain issues. I do want to tell a little story of how the digitization impacts companies and how it changed the outlook for companies. So we have one of our clients, a large retail organization that has its own meat processing capability. And just before the pandemic, they completely retooled their meat processing plants. Their goal was to automate as much as possible, remove humans from as many spots in the organization as possible, automate as much of the decision making on the meat packing shop floor as they could. And they did it just to save money and keep their costs down. And they ran a couple pilot plants, and they were very successful. And then the pandemic hit. And the weird part about all this is their competitors all had to shut down their meat packing plants for a period of time. They were able to keep their modernized meat packing plants running. And they were actually able to not only sustain themselves, they were able to capture market share from some of the meat processors who had to shut down. And they did not predict the pandemic. What they did is they built out a digital transformation journey that was aligned with being able to handle almost anything that came along and being able to make very fast, very effective decisions. And so I think, that's an anecdotal look at companies that were digitally prepared when the pandemic hit and got through the pandemic relatively successfully. And of course, we look at the impact of the digital transformation journey by region. All the regions have seen a major impact. They're all pushing towards digital transformation. It's been accelerated coming out of the pandemic, or even in the middle of the pandemic. We saw coming out of Latin America, in fact, in our data, was they really have some of the biggest push for digital transformation. There was a recognition there that they weren't digitally ready, they weren't digitally resilient, so they needed to make a move there. So we're going to quickly look at the future of the food and beverage industry. We've kind of defined, where we are in the pandemic, post-pandemic, digital transformation. So let's take a quick look at the future and what the data shows us here. We looked at what was the impact over the next 5 years or out to 5 years. And what really, I'm a former plant manager in a manufacturing organization, and I actually went back and questioned this data to validate that it was correct, that cost was not the top choice here. Cost is almost always the top one or two. And for once, we did not see cost as a primary driver. We saw really a reflection on, and two, in some ways, interrelated topics, the change in consumer demand and preferences. And it wasn't just the change itself, it was the speed of change and the constant change that we saw over the last 2 years. And that coming out of that was a push towards sustainability and environmental stewardship. Every company we talked to today, at least in the top three, is sustainability. And it's sustainability around multiple perspectives. There's just what I would call standard energy management, being able to be more resilient around energy, faster decision making, reducing your carbon footprint. There's also a sustainability approach around the type of ingredients you're putting in your products, managing your supply chain in a much more sustainable manner. And the funny part is the number 3 point on this list, emerging technology and data solutions. It is where people are looking to help drive the solutions to the top 2. And that is being able to have better access to all the data you're generating to make those sustainability decisions, better access to the consumer. I think in the couple of slides up, we talked to one executive in food and beverage that talked about being able to analyze consumer preferences faster and make more effective decisions. You're going to hear me talking a lot about decision making, and that's why this is all about taking your data and being able to build a more effective decision making framework, and that ties right into changes in consumer demand and preferences. Being able to go to your ecosystem and get faster access to data and be able to analyze it faster. And of course, number 4 is the old standby. Cut costs, lower prices, pressure on margins. I think this was done several months ago. I think if we did this again today, that might be the lower prices piece might even be lower, because there is now the kind of built-in inflation factor where consumers are much more ready to pay a little bit more to get what they need. So I think that also is going to have an impact on the future of the food and beverage industry. So I think the thing to keep in mind, the takeaway from this is variability in demand and the sustainability and environmental aspects of it, and how you're using data to manage those. So, related to that, the impact, we asked food and beverage executives what really worries them, what are the top threats to the industry over the next 5 years? And I think, obviously, over the last 2 years, the thing that's at the forefront of people's mind is future global disruption, ties directly in to the resilience and the resiliency around decision making. Just that again, the top 2 are interrelated. Disruptive marketplace. We were, as I mentioned, when we did this survey, right in the throes of the initial stages of the supply chain issues. And then, of course, number 3, you see it again, significant shift to sustainability priorities. There is an entire aspect in the food and beverage industry being built around not just energy and water waste, but actually sustainable supply chains and sustainable ecosystems. And of course, number 4, we see shrinking profit margins and input cost increases, which are being reflected in the inflation that we're seeing in many places today. And the word I heard that scared me a little bit, I think it scares a lot of food and beverage executives, is the word uncontrollable. It was felt that some of these cost issues are beyond their control, and they're looking for inflation to be kind of the relief valve on the other end. So what are some of the trends? You think of these worries, what they see happening in the next 5 years. Industry trend, first one, what do we see? We see sustainability, as we've talked about already. Food regulation and legislation being driven. You see food safety down here is number 4, but that's tied right to food regulation and safety and legislation. They see a lot of governments really starting to look at how and it actually ties a little bit into sustainability, but basically how sustainable are the supply chains around food. And then, of course, employees' health and safety. This is right at the forefront because of the pandemic issues, and that is being able to build the future of the future workplace, being able to ensure that your employees are not only personally safe, but are not creating an unhealthy environment or an unsafe environment. We see a major focus on that. And then number 5, I point out because it ties right into sustainability, and that's just efficiency and waste reduction. In fact, what you see a lot of is a lot of big sustainability initiatives at the corporate level are sometimes driven by efficiency and waste reduction projects that have been going on for years, if not decades. And so those 2 are tightly linked and intertwined. So, Jack, let's bring your perspective on this. You talk to a lot of food and beverage executives, and you've seen kind of what we've got in the data here. What do you see when you talk to them personally? What's in the forefront of their minds? What are they worried about, and how are they addressing it?
Yeah, and Kevin, one of the reasons we like to do this and sponsor this is so that not only we get our perspective on what we've done, but we also make sure we're understanding from the industry. And I thought it was very interesting on a couple of slides ago. where from an industry trend, they saw the solution to their problems was investment in technology. But, we're seeing a lot of the same things, where cost used to always be the biggest factor. Cost is still important and profit's still important. But, as you say, that's kind of been pushed down on other things, below other things with this. We're hearing a lot about sustainability, and a lot of it is, I still see from what you've said, a lot of it is more from that corporate perspective of how do we improve efficiency, how do we reduce waste, which are key components of sustainability, but it's more than just that making up sustainability with this. The other thing is food safety, traceability legislation is always a key topic. This is not something that's new to the industry, but people have been dealing with this for years, but they're continuing to deal with it. And I think because of consumer demands and also just transparency being part of those consumer demands, is that companies understand now they need to protect their brand, they need to protect their image and protect the company in case there is a recall, so that they can contain that recall, so that they retain that customer. I know that there are a few brands in the marketplace that I'm going to say years ago had unsuccessful recalls, that as a consumer, I avoid those brands myself because I just don't have confidence in that. Now, I'm sure they probably have recovered and are probably doing fine, but again, I've lost that confidence as a consumer. And I think that's what's driving a lot of the food safety, the traceability trends, and what keep people awake at night with this.
Yeah, I think it's funny you say that about that. My wife and I talk about this a lot, and that is when we see a recall that's had a significant impact on a company, we always say, we should go buy from that company because they probably fixed all their processes.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect of it. Jack, I want to ask you kind of a follow-up question because it's an issue we hear people talking about today, and that's around labor issues, talent, worker availability. How much of an impact do you think? So when you look at these five-year trend, how much of an impact do you think that's going to have 5 years from now? Are we still going to be struggling with talent? Will we have adjusted to it? What do you think is going to happen?
I want to be optimistic and think that we're going to let that go further and further down the list, and I hope that's the case. And I know a lot of times people are looking at investing in digital transformation, very much like the example that you had from automation within the factory. But it's not just automation within the factory, it's also automation and efficiency in the office as well. So that instead of taking 3 people to collect information into a spreadsheet, that now we have analytics that's being able not only to collect that information, but also artificial intelligence that can help us with what that actual information is, so that we're not spending as much time collecting and analyzing information. We're focusing our efforts on what we can do to improve the business with this. So I think companies are going to become more efficient. I still think there's always going to be the skilled worker. It's always going to be somewhere in that top 10. But I'm optimistic that we're going to find ways to be able to be more efficient and not to be as big a problem as it is today.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something that's near and dear to my heart. I brought this slide back up because I want to point out right in the middle, AI for decision support and our robotic process automation for manual operations. I love telling little stories, so I'm going to tell another little story. I was at a manufacturing company going back maybe about a month ago. I was actually touring their facilities. It was my first trip since the pandemic started, in fact. And as I'm walking through with the CIO and the senior vice president of manufacturing, and the senior vice president of manufacturing stopped and told me, right in the middle of a massive plant, 3 million square feet, and told me to look around and tell him what I saw. And I'm smarter than I look. I said, well, I see a lot of people standing around. And because I was a former plant manager, and this is things I notice. And he said, bingo, that's it. He said, what's going on right now is I have so many staff people standing around in the plant waiting for something to go wrong because they need to react to it right away. He goes, I have no way to really automate that right now. So we had a long discussion, and I'm telling you, through the rest of that tour, the term automate came up every single part of the conversation. And just what you talked about, Jack, and that is being able to automate parts of that. you've got these layers of middle management. Being able to compress that layer of middle management, speed up decision making, make it more effective. That's something I think is a massive theme across not just food and beverage, but across all manufacturing companies. All right, I'm sorry, I'll get off my soapbox for a minute.
No, I definitely agree with you. And, you know, I was like you, I was also a plant manager many years ago. And, you know, as always, has puzzled me. You walk into a factory, it seems like it's a lot like the construction industry. You see a lot of people standing around, but you wonder when things really get produced.
Yeah, that's right. You know, all leaning on shovels.
Yeah.
And I think it ties into what we're talking about today, and that is, I think the digital if we look pre-pandemic, digital transformation was about digitizing as much as you could to speed up product to market. And I think the shift that's happened through the pandemic, and you know, maybe just at the beginning of the post-pandemic, is the shift in focus for digital transformation has really been about automation, and I think a lot of it's been driven by the real two things, and I'll talk about it related to this in a minute. The slide that's up, it's tied into the ability to operate more resiliently with fewer people, you know, directly hands-on with the product. That's one. And you know, in the food and beverage industry, the more people you have putting hands on product, the more likely you are to have something go wrong. And I think the other part of it is the decision-making piece, you know, being able to make faster, more effective decisions. And now looking at this KPI, this slide, KPI performance tied to digital transformation, 80% of the respondents to the survey said they had improvements in their KPIs and their critical key performance indicators tied directly to digital transformation initiatives. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but if you look at the sampling we have here of improvements they saw, you know, supply chain operations, logistics, inventory warehousing, all tied to warehouse automation, production overall equipment effectiveness. So the efficiency of the assets you're using, your quality and scrap, procurement, maintenance utilization and asset utilization, everything all the way down to the consumer. You know, these were all critical areas in food and beverage manufacturing, and the far majority of companies that were doing digital transformation saw improvements very rapidly in those KPIs. Overall, companies that had felt they were fairly mature in digital transformation had revenue up 4% and their margins up 1%. So digital transformation as a focus area, as a kind of a lightning rod for your corporation is critical to start to move forward there. Now, that brings us to what is the state of digital transformation in the food and beverage industry. And I think what we saw coming out of this survey is most companies, the majority of companies, I think it's about 2/3, have either they felt completed their digital transformation projects and are already getting benefits from it, or they're actually gathering data and using the analytics for business insights. And usually we look at that as a maturity step, and that is the kind of the first step to digital transformation is that being able to collect the data, and not even just collect data, but ingest the data to the point where you can start to use that data to make some really important and fast decisions. Companies that have completed digital transformation have already done that, and there's probably a deeper level of digital transformation that's going on, and they're getting benefits from that. So basically, what this comes down to is most companies, almost all. I mean, you can probably there is a statistical error here. You could say all companies are at least starting or thinking about digital transformation, with 2/3 are in progress or have started gathering information, doing the insights. And then you got about 1/4 that have actually completed their projects and are realizing benefits from it. So I think that's some validation that this is the direction companies have to go. So we talk about all the good things. What are the challenges? First big one I think everyone talks about, and that's silos. You have limited visibility across your entire operation. It may be by business unit, it may be by product line, it may be by location. But one of the most difficult things for any decision-making framework is gathering all that information across all those parts of your organization, normalizing the information so that you're comparing apples to apples, and then being able to present it to the decision makers in a format that they can ingest quickly and then get the decision back down to take an action. And you look at a typical large organization, that can take weeks. When I ran a plant, we made decisions month to month. We couldn't do anything more granular than that unless you were physically there on the plant floor. And part of this, part of the issues that companies see are, just a lack of awareness of what are the solutions out there. You get a software vendor coming telling you, well, this will fix your problem, but will it? How do I know? What are the best practices? And then, of course, you have your own internal issues around budgets, resources, and just resistance to change. So these are all the issues that companies typically deal with. One of the things you need to do, and we'll talk about this at the end, is being able to look at a technology and understand the impact it's going to have on your organization and start to adjust your organization to align with that digital transformation initiative you're working with. So Jack, just again, your perspective as these food and beverage companies start their digital journey, what kind of understand the maturity, what KPIs should they be looking at first? Because you can't change everything at once, but what are the things you think they should be focusing on?
Yeah, I think there are a few items with that, just like I'm going to say that you do from a food safety plan. You go through and determine where your weaknesses are at and where you need to improve that. In a food and beverage company, there are going to be certain KPIs they need to look at. Is it things like on-time performance with their customers? What is their delivery rate from the suppliers? I know that's a big problem today with lead times coming from suppliers. Looking at product like shelf life, are they having expired products? Again, how are they doing in terms of their cost? How are they doing in terms of profitability? So I think each company needs to look at these specifics and determine what those 3 or 4 key metrics they need to be looking at that's really going to move the business. You can come up with 100 different scorecards, but which of those scorecards are really going to move the business forward with that is what's key to those companies.
I think that's a really important point, is just to focus on a key few.
Yeah.
So with that said, I think this is an important aspect of it as well, and that is, what's the perception of business versus IT? This is a battle that's been going on for decades. Business needs versus IT needs, and IT supporting the business. So we picked our 3 critical areas: food safety, supply chain, and smart manufacturing. And we asked people, what's your organization's maturity, digital maturity across these areas? And what was interesting is IT was much more optimistic about the maturity than the line of business. And I think some of this comes from, Jack, you're a former plant manager. You develop a little bit of cynicism, when you're on the operations side of the business. So I think that's reflected here. So what you can take away from this in the audience is that, you need to kind of try to align line of business and IT to make sure they have the same perspective on your various initiatives. And again, I just pointed out 3 that we think are important for food and beverage. So that's something you really need to be thinking about. And of course, we wanted to focus a little bit on the traceability piece and just try to understand how important it is. And I think this slide really lays it out. It's anywhere from medium importance to high importance. And you look over onto the left and you see not many companies in the low importance side. Everyone's focused on some form of traceability no matter what region they're in. And this is one of those that if you were to guess, you'd say there's certain regions that may be more focused than others. And in the end, it really, across the board, all regions are heavily focused on traceability. So where do you find traceability is limited and the most challenging for your organization? And this is one I talk about engineering change orders all the time. My analysts who work for me are so tired. Every time they bring up a new technology, first thing I say, what's the impact on the engineering change order? Because it's one of the areas where the breakdowns happen, is getting changes from product development to manufacturing, to distribution, to packaging. I got a little backwards there, but those changes, sometimes you put systems in and it works perfectly one way, but doesn't work the other way. But that engineering change order practice capability, it's one of the first things I look at when I go in and look at a company and say, how well do they run? How well do they run as an organization across all their different silos? I look at ECOs. And then the second thing I look at, which is in some ways tied into ECOs, standard operating procedures and GMP. And being able to set those standard operating procedures, maintain them, because that's the hard part, is maintaining them. I think that's also critical. And it's just then you can go all the way down through this. Employee qualification, inspection, and testing. This is all the paperwork, well, digital paperwork. This is the thread that runs through your entire organization about the product. That's what traceability really is can you pull that thread all the way through? And where things like engineering change orders and SOPs and GMP, employee qualifications, where they become kinks in that thread, where stuff is disconnected, you don't have the continuity you need to move information. So I think that's really important. Jack, you heard me talk a little detail about traceability. Why do you think there's such a great focus on traceability right now?
And that's a question I keep asking myself. I've been involved in food and beverage for 25 plus years now. And back in the 90s, it was, I would say, more forward-looking companies, forward-thinking companies that knew that traceability was part of protecting their brand, protecting their image. And then we got 20 years ago with the Global Food Safety Initiative, where people got on board with that, which increased a surge in traceability. 10 years ago, we had FSMA. It's hard to believe it's been 10 years ago since those legislation was passed. That caused, I'm going to say, another interest in traceability. But it continues. It goes on and on. And sometimes I ask myself, well, why don't we get it correct? It's been around for a while. But like you say, there are a lot of challenges to it. And if we look at the number of recalls, almost half of those recalls are due to mislabeled product. It's not that the product's wrong, it's mislabeled. And when I look at the challenges that you have, I think the top two challenges are probably a lot of the reasons for the mislabeled product, in terms that maybe you've made the product to the right recipe, but for some reason the packaging or the label that goes on it is the last version of that ingredient with that. Or maybe there's been standard operating procedures broken down and something's happened. There was a recall recently, probably most of us heard about, where I think somebody was making pepperoni pizza and they put cheese pizza in the box, or vice versa. I don't know how you could be that big of an error, but that was definitely a breakdown in standard operating procedure. So I think we're seeing more and more of that, and I think people also realizing, due to the pandemic, we need to be tracing more than just the material or the product, the ingredients to the process. We need to be tracing the process as well. So what happens if on this particular packaging line or on this particular kettle that we didn't have proper sanitation 2 days ago? Well, we need to be able to trace everything that's occurred through the process, not just the product with it. And if I look kind of the end of it, everybody from a food standpoint, it ends up with a consumer consuming that food. And there's a lot of transparency to the consumers today. Social media has brought that up. And someone has a bad experience, that may be tweeted or that may be posted somewhere that a lot of people see. And so that transparency is very important. And like you say, years ago, we used to make decisions on a monthly basis. Now people are making decisions more often. People don't read the newspaper anymore, which is used to see information daily. Now you see things coming to you every second, every minute. So I think that's all the reasons behind this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think I hadn't really considered that from a traceability perspective, that the immediateness of the feedback you're getting and the spread of information or misinformation, either one, but the speed of it makes traceability so much more important, because you're going to be asked, even if you're in operations, you're going to be asked much more often and much more pointedly, why did this happen? Why did the wrong label get put on this? Because that can really hurt your brand. All right, I think that was a good one. Now, so let's look at some of the, we talked a little bit about the technology. Let's focus on that a little bit. So we asked what was going to be the greatest impact, technology with the greatest impact over the next 5 years, and there weren't huge differences. I just think we need to point some stuff out here. IT, obviously right now thinks cloud has a greater impact than line of business, which actually really surprised me. Same with artificial intelligence. In fact, I want to kind of point out something on artificial intelligence. We did another survey on operations and AI in operations just a couple weeks ago. It came out, and what we found was like close to 90% of the executives, manufacturing executives we interviewed said that AI was a critical technology for their future over the next 2 to 3 years. Our next question was, over the next 2 to 3 years, how many I'm trying to think what the question was. It was basically, how much have you implemented over the next, or will you have implemented over the next 2 to 3 years for AI projects? Only 30% said they were going to have something up and running in the next 2 to 3 years. So the dichotomy there is, and I think gets a little reflected here, there's a lot of hype around AI, a lot of hype around these super advanced analytics that technology people get hung up on, but the people running the business have a hard time figuring out where they're going to get a return on it. So I think, these are the kind of things you need to walk away with from this particular set of data is, making sure that the expectations for the digitization and the different pieces of digitization are aligned between your technology people and your business business people. So now what I want to do is take a quick look at this from a level perspective, not just looking at business versus IT. And guess what I'm going to zero in on? Look at that second one down. C-level say, oh, AI is going to drive our business for the next 5 years. And then look at the directors and vice presidents, people who actually have to execute it. They're way down there, half the expectations. And so I think, again, the thing to walk away from this one is, be careful of the hype around things like AI, and make sure that you have an understanding and a roadmap for how some of these technologies will actually apply to your digital roadmap. So with that said, Jack, I'm going to turn to you. I got a quick question, because we're going to start focusing a little bit on enterprise technology. What are some of the differences you see between regions in enterprise technology?
Yeah, I think it, is where they stand in the maturity, stand in their adoption of that, but also kind of bring into that the different perspective, I think, between IT and line of business. And when I think about digital transformation, I think it's a journey. And I also kind of equate it to continuous improvement, that you have, I call them milestones along the way where you make significant improvements, but I think there's always improvement to be made. That yes, you may have completed this project, but then there's probably another project behind it that can give you further improvements with this. And I think that's where we're seeing some of that difference between line of business and between IT, where IT says, okay, the project's implemented, the line of business may not be fully utilizing that yet because they haven't changed all their processes or procedures to that. Now, that didn't really address the question that you asked me, Kevin, in terms of from the differences by the various regions. And I think from what you've seen before too, is I'd say North America and South America, I don't know, for whatever reason, they are typically, I'm going to say, have more technology implemented in various areas, along with EMEA as well. I think in some places of South America and APAC, all those places are catching up. They've also had other challenges during the pandemic as well, where a lot of those areas have been suppliers, so forth, to North America, and they've had their own challenges to face. And I think part of it was, the pandemic. Where did it start, and what were the different stages of the pandemic during the time with that?
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think, as people looking at this slide while you're talking can see is the expected change in spending. It's very positive. People are going to start investing. I think this is tied directly to the digitization. There's a foundation you've got to lay to digitize. If you don't have a good underlying business technology foundation, you're really going to struggle. You're going to be much less effective. So companies are recognizing that and are opening up their wallets to how they're going to develop that enterprise software foundation. So that's very good, Jack. Thank you. So your ERP cloud strategy, I think, and as I mentioned, you got to have that foundation. I think it's tied somewhat, or shouldn't say somewhat, pretty heavily towards your ERP strategy. You got to have that foundational business system. One of the things we hear talking about, and Jack, I'm going to ask you for your perspective on this in a minute, is we hear a lot about cloud strategy, ERP in the cloud. And I think what we see here from our survey is that no matter what your maturity level, there's still a lot of on-prem that's going to happen. People have implemented, they don't have a cloud strategy yet. And so they're looking, you can see that it's moving towards the cloud, but I don't think it's moving as fast as everyone expected. There's still a lot of implementations out there that are on-prem. So that's the first point. The second point is, from cloud perspective, is we see from this data, and IDC sees it anecdotally as well with our clients, that companies that have moved into the cloud have significant improvements over their business operations. They, basically everyone has some improvement when they do a new ERP implementation, but the people moving to the cloud with ERP are having better results than on-prem. Part of that, I think, is kind of when you're moving to the cloud, there's a heavy focus on digitization of everything. So they tend to get the benefits of digitization. Whereas on-prem, it's more about your business processes, making sure they're as efficient as possible. So I think that's where you see that distinction. So I just, when you walk away from this slide, you should be thinking, I'll have improvements by going on-prem and upgrading my ERP and make sure it's modern and can be used for digitization. But I'm probably going to have better results if I move to the cloud. But again, as we say here, everyone's kind of a winner. And you look at some of the quotes we have, all the stuff focused on customer quality. They're all the big winners in this. So Jack, with that said, where do you see cloud playing out in your customer base?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Kevin, and that's a question we get every day, from existing customers and also from companies that are not customers of ours. And we had a fairly large food and beverage company a couple of years ago that they made an original decision to go on premise. They got started a couple months into the process, and then they came to us and said, we think we made a wrong decision. We'd like to move to the cloud. And we moved them to the cloud before they got started. And what was interesting, they summed it up very well. 6 months after this process, the CIO came back to us and said, by going to the cloud, we've been able to focus our IT efforts and our people on running the business. We didn't have to focus on the infrastructure and the backups and all other things we had to do. So we're able to actually implement the system faster, provide better support internally to our users using it. That was just one small example from that.
Yeah.
But I think the way we like to talk about it is, we're experts at technology. You're experts at producing food or beverage or whatever particular product you're producing. You do what you do well. We do what we do well. And we come together and we partner with each other so that we can both benefit from this. Now I think that's a very good story. IT or ERP systems, and I'm going to say all the extensions in ERP for digital transformation has become very, very complex over the years. And most companies, again, with that cost pressure, they're trying to do as much as they can with as few people. And so sometimes they just don't have the technology resources to do all this. So if they can focus on their business, leave the technology or the cloud piece up to their cloud provider, I think it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that's the point we're trying to make here, generally speaking, is that you got to lay that digital foundation. ERP plays a critical role in that. Moving to the cloud digitizes it one more step up than doing on-prem, but there is, generally speaking, it's better to have a modern on-prem system than to have an older system to begin with. I think it's probably that point. Now, with that said, we're going to move on to our last slide, or at least the discussion slide. Then we'll go to questions. And I've already talked about some of these. We tried to keep a 5-year focus on the future, and it's really about sustainability and consumer. And of course, people are still wondering, what's the next big disruption? And then, the priorities going through 2022 into 2023 about traceability, safety, and sustainability, and they're all somewhat linked. And of course, the differing perceptions by leaders. I think that's something most companies need to get a handle on and make sure that the expectations around digitization and technology align between the business and IT, as well as different levels of the organization, from the people who are, the thought leaders of the company, all the way down to people who actually have to execute stuff. And, you really can't go wrong investing in organizing your data and getting your data accessible, especially, if you got that ERP foundation, that's really important. But your C-level is going to probably continue to be focused on AI and what can it do, because they're looking a little further out into the future, and they're looking at that automation. We talked about that decision-making framework. That's really where AI plays a critical role. And of course, as I said, the foundation of that is your enterprise software acquisitions and implementations. But the thing to keep in mind is even the most immature DX implementation, even if you're just starting, will immediately have impact on some of your KPIs. And that's what you need to start looking at to justify it. And of course, cloud ERP, that's kind of a force multiplier for you. Being able to bring that business system, make the data more accessible, get it to across more of your silos. I think that's really, really important. So with that said, our recommended actions are, to basically aggressively pursue digital transformation. I don't think there's anything more we can say about it. You need to assess the current state of your ERP. Doesn't have to be in the cloud, but it helps. Don't be overly focused on AI, but you've got to look at it, and you've got to look at that decision-making framework around automating as much as you can to mitigate short-term labor issues or even long-term labor issues. And then all that will fall out of that will be your traceability and sustainability. I mean, you kind of need to be looking at those out towards the future a little bit as you're building out your digital transformation strategy. So with that said, I am going to turn it over to Hillary, and I think she's gonna, there's some questions that have come in. So you wanna start asking us those questions, and you can, just the easy ones though, we don't want the hard ones.
All right, Kevin, Jack, thank you so much. A few questions for you here. I'm sure we can have a whole presentation just on this, but one of the questions was, what are the top 3 issues heading into 2022?
Jack, do you want to take that?
Well, I think a lot of it's going back to what you presented, Kevin, in terms of, what do we see as the trends, but also what do we see as what's keeping people awake at night with this. So yeah, I think, consumer demands, changing consumer demands, the uncertainty, and I think that's one of the lessons learned from the pandemic, is that there is a lot of uncertainty in the world today. So being able to be prepared for uncertainty, be able to be resilient, and not being rigid from that capability. I think I might have given you 2, so maybe you can give us a third one, Kevin.
Well, I'll give you a third one and a couple more. I'm just going to give you a different perspective, and I think automation is the short-term one, as much as you can, and that falls out of your digital transformation strategy. But when I say automation, a lot of people think about physical automation of machines. I'm talking about automating as much of those manual processes as you can. And I think that eventually leads to what I call that decision-making framework. I think your long-term view has to be around, how do you build a framework that brings the data to the decision makers as quickly as possible, provides them the insight they need in a format they can use, and then moves their actions down to the point of activity as quickly as possible. I used to have when I was an engineer, I had a boss who told me if I had a decision that needed to be made, but I really didn't want anyone to make a decision, give it to his boss, because it would sit on his desk for a couple months and then everyone would forget about it. And that's kind of what I'm getting to, is that, we need to be able to make those decisions very, very fast. You can't have those dead zones of decision making, and shining a digital flashlight on those blind spots will help, move those decisions along faster and make them more effective. I hope I answered the question.
You did. You did for me.
Thank you so much. Here's another one for you guys. Jack, this might be a good one for you. Which companies are good examples for leaning into digital? And are there many smaller middle market companies adapting?
Yeah, so I think the question is dealing with what technology solutions are available with that. Well, of course, I would suggest Aptean to be someone that you consider from a food and beverage standpoint. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to provide more than just ERP, but to be able to provide digital transformation for our customers. Not trying to turn this into a commercial for Aptean, but we also have a number of partners that we work with as well too that we can recommend. But I think the key thing is, picking someone who has the experience and the knowledge and the capability in food and beverage that you can partner with, that you feel good in partnering with, that's going to be around, they're going to be viable, and that you can trust to continue to bring technology to you as industry changes.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to look at it from a retailer food and beverage perspective. I think companies like ConAgra have done a pretty you kind of, and I'm glad you did this. You have to separate really big companies from smaller companies, but from a really big company perspective, ConAgra has done a fairly good job of transforming itself. Some people might disagree with what they've done, that they've kind of moved away from some of their core values. But I think they recognize where the world's going, and they've done a pretty good job of digitizing themselves, of really being innovative in how they approach their brands and letting their brands lead their digitization. So I would look at a big company like ConAgra as someone, I'm trying to think of as a mid-size, not really another mid-size company, but let's look at Costco. I think Costco's done a fairly amazing job through the pandemic of digitizing a lot of their backroom operations, a lot of their production facilities where they make some of their own products. I think they've done a really, really good job of managing their supply chain. They are usually one of the first companies to react to supply chain or feedstock issues. So I think they do a pretty good job of managing it. Again, they're not a small company, but they're not massive. Well, I guess maybe they are in some ways as a ConAgra. So that's my perspective.
All right, here's another one for you guys. Talking with CEOs in the food industry, there's a list of priorities. Get personal with benefits, be COVID-free, raise wages, be super remote, work flexible, and upgrade IT. What would you add to that list?
Can you read the list again?
The list is get personal with benefits, be COVID-free, raise wages, be super remote, work flexible, and upgrade IT.
I'd say be data centric. I think, and that sounds like an easy answer, but I think when you start talking about upgrading IT, I think, you need to have that data centricity. And again, that ties back into, I think everything you do set aside the customers and consumers the most important, because that's true. But I think everything you do needs to be around building that decision-making capability and enhancing that. So if you're trying, one of the things you talk about, there's some stuff wrapped up in here around labor and retention of talent. I think getting to that decision-making framework usually means you have to have some sort of knowledge capture capability. That is, capturing the knowledge of long-term employees with their institutional knowledge. I would add those things to it, and that is building the decision-making capability and knowledge capture of critical employees.
And Kevin, just to add to that, that's along the same lines I had, because as Amanda read that list a second time, to me, those seem like actions to perform. But I think the real part is, what's the goal we're trying to achieve? And then from that, but again, I'm with you on that goal is having actual information that doesn't sit on somebody's desk, and we're too late to act on it.
Yep.
All right, we are coming up on the hour, so I will just do one more quick one. What should a food and beverage company prioritize when executing a DX strategy?
I think aligning the business and the technology. I know that sounds like an easy thing, and it's really a lot of change management. So I would focus on that from a strategy perspective. If I looked at tactical stuff, I would look at, and I know people are going to laugh when I say this, but I would look at engineering change orders. How do you manage your engineering change orders? If you can focus on that and optimize that process and through your digital strategy, I think you'll start to see some really good stuff falling out of that. But because it ties data, it ties automation, it ties breaking down silos, it kind of ties everything together. So if I walked into like I said, when I walk into any food and beverage manufacturer, the first thing I look at is how do they manage engineering change orders? And maybe there's an informal side of that. I mean, there's a formal side of that. There's an informal. How do you manage change in general? You know, when you have to change a feedstock coming in for your process, you know, how do you permeate that change, you know, throughout all the way down to your distribution and notifying customers and stuff like that? I would look at those type of processes that manage change and use that as kind of my benchmark for how I'm doing. I think I forgot the
All right.
question. Anyways.
Yes, and we are up for time today. So Kevin, Jack, it was excellent having you on. Thank you so much for everyone attending and joining today. Keep an eye on your inbox for the recording of the event and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.